Hi, good morning. Thanks for being here, and thanks for having us here as well. So I'm just going to start a little bit by speaking about the framework of the discussion, which has been kindly provided by our host here. So I'll just read out the title. So the title is Time Travelers, When Artists Remix the Past to Reframe the Present. So the suggestion for our talks is, what can we learn from artists who take on the role of historians by recovering, retelling, and remixing stories and testimonies from the past in their works? So I just want us to keep that frame in mind as we begin our discussion. So to kick off today, I would like to invite each of the artists to speak briefly about one or two of their works so that everybody has a sense of our practice. And then we can start with the conversations. So to begin with, I would like to invite Chi Yin. Yeah.
Thank you, Nyen. And thanks for having us. So I guess I should begin by basically contextualizing these two bodies of work that I will reference in this talk today. I'm going to be talking about a new 2-channel video called The Mountain That Hid, which is actually showing upstairs at the Zilberman Gallery booth at 3C17. And then the other body of work that I will talk about today is a series of glass plates that I've made last year, which is titled The Suitcase is a Little Bit Rotten. So the first thing to say about these two bodies of work is that they come from a broader multi-chapter work that is titled One Day We'll Understand. And that work really has been something that I've been engaged with in the last decade. It begins from family history. I had my paternal grandfather was someone whom we never spoke about in the family. And so I became very curious about why that was. For over 60 years, he was never memorialized in the family. And I started to dig into the woodwork and basically found out that he had died for communism. And that's why he was written out of the family history. And so over the last 12 years or so, I've been excavating his story, and this project kind of went way beyond family history into a kind of excavation of that period and that particular anti-colonial war in British Malaya, what is today Malaysia and Singapore. So we're talking about war that happened between 1948 and 1960, and so I've been making different bodies of work around this conflict. And in multi-form. So some of it is photographic installation, some of it's film, there's a performance lecture, and there's soon to be a theatrical performance as well. So the two bodies of work that I'm going to talk about in relation to time travel today are the 2-channel video, The Mountain That Hid. That sort of takes my grandfather's deportation from British Malaya by the British as a point of departure to sort of speculate about the circularity of time and of history, and as well the movement of people, the movement of the Chinese diaspora from Southeast Asia to China. From China to Southeast Asia and then back around. And the other body of work, which is a series of glass plates, is where I've reappropriated magic lantern slides from the early 1900s and used them as sort of a site of time travel for both my grandfather as well as my toddler son, because I became interested in this idea of transgenerational inheritance. So basically, yeah, I used these magic lantern slides to open up a kind of space of imagination because they depict landscapes of Southeast Asia, not necessarily specifically Malaya, but I kind of make interventions in them to suggest the idea that there could be things that sort of transpire from generation to generation. And I've just been thinking a lot about whether time really travels in a linear way or it travels in circles, and the same for history. So those are the two bodies of work that kind of relate to the idea of time travel.
Thank you so much for the very good introduction. Before handing over to Mónica, it also just struck me that I'm really pleased to do this panel with all the artists here because I myself am an artist and I see certain resonance in the way we approach time and history. So I would say all of us here work with and in time. Because all of us work in some sense with time-based media, whether it's the moving image or the photographic image. So these are all mediums that deal with time. But we also all deal with time in a different sense because we are all, in one way or another, engaging with history. So with that, I would like to invite Mónica.
Hi everyone, thank you for the Art Basel invitation, and it's great to be here with you. So I have two works that we've been seeing. One that is in the film sector here in Art Basel, that Path to the Stars, that was also at Berlin Biennale, and The Island. They are connected, very connected in terms of what they represent. One was shot in Angola, and one was shot in Portugal. And they talk also about the duality of belonging in my own place, as I'm Angolan Portuguese, and I've been constantly moving between these two places. I'm very interested on storytelling, and usually the places, they tell me the story. So the places that the film represents, they were places that they have a connection, biographical connection to me. And then I spend time in these places and the story comes out from there. So Path to the Stars has many references, historical references to different books. Actually, Path to the Stars comes from a poem. He points out for a new future during the colonial period in Angola. And it was written by the first president. There was a poet, Agostinho Neto. So he actually was pointing out for a new future while there was the colonial oppression. And this is where I start off. And in Angola, there is not an official story written. So we can read fictional books or romances from different authors from Angola, and we can really understand through critical fabulation different historical factors that they were not told, and told stories. So Path to the Stars also tells the story of the importance of the women in the liberation struggles and how did they had to fight twice. And it's reclaiming their voice. And actually the main character, she comes from another book, from a journalist. There is a Polish journalist that he came to Angola to record the independence. And when he arrived, the book is called, and is from Kapuscinski, One More Day in Our Life, Angola, 1975. And when he arrived, he documented in his book the exodus from the Portuguese people, and he told us how the city became completely empty, ghosted. And after he went to, the Civil War started after the independence, straight after, and he went into documenting the war, and he met Carlota, and Carlota, it's a woman that she became a myth for the liberation struggle. It is the only picture in his book. And after Carlota, he met, after 2 days, she got shot on a hand bush. So we don't know much about Carlota, and you could see in the image, there was an archival image also from Amilcar Cabral, from Carlota. And so the film is a way of retelling that story, but it's not, it has a poetic double meaning, because even if he uses the river as a metaphor of time, and where I look at the past, present, and future. the river conceals all the history of Angola, but also she goes in the quest of self-liberation, emotional, physical, spiritually. So it's a relationship with another time, a cyclical time, a feminine time. So the relationship with body, nature, and human body, and all this cyclical way of understanding in the pre-colonial culture that time, it hasn't got an end or a beginning. It's important on the film, and the film is really about bringing out these different times, and the same with the island. So they are very connected about trying to give a voice to an untold story. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think, before handing over to Kenneth, I would also like to mention a little bit, I think some of the implicit assumptions in the frame that we started with, which is a certain kind of like connection between the artist and the historian, which is also to say a relation between art and history. So we all, in one sense or another, work with that. So I think these are, questions that we can unpack later. Another thing which I wanted to bring up with the framework that we are discussing with certain terms, which I also observed that all of us here use quite a bit, which are terms like retelling, remixing, yeah. And in a certain sense, it's also about revisiting the past or the past returning. So with that note, I'd like to hand over to Kenneth.
Okay, hi everyone, thank you for coming. The works that I'll be talking about today are primarily a 2-channel video installation called Silent Spikes and a series of accompanying sculptures that are part of an exhibition that is currently up right now in the US in a venue called Ballroom Martha in Texas. And the work is actually upstairs. Some of the work is upstairs in my gallery's booth. And the project, Silent Spikes, is a video that looks at a number of different threads that, some of which continue in previous works, and uses history and historical references as a kind of material. My practice is not necessarily primarily a research-based one, though there is research that occurs. But in this specific video work, I do reference a very particular history, and that of the Chinese laborers that came from actually this region in southern China to work on the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in the U.S. in the late 19th century. The video interweaves imagery of a group of non-professional performers who self-identify as Asian American in a series of activities that I came up for them. And those activities are meant to create conditions in which their, let's say, vulnerability can be put on display. A lot of my work looks at ideas about vulnerability and how intimacy is created within group situations amongst men. And that thread is interwoven with this more historical narrative that looks at the precarious situation of these laborers who came to work here. And in the video, there are these moments, these shots really in the tunnels in which they dug out in Northern California in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And for me, I was really thinking about these large voids as kinds of portals that allow us to kind of think back in time and to consider how these kind of historical events might influence the present. So much of that project is really actually thinking about absence and the void. And I didn't necessarily want to fill that void. It wasn't necessarily about repopulating the present with these characters who have been, at least in sort of the conventional American history that we tell ourselves, does not include these individuals, this large group of workers. Rather, I was really thinking about how can I make the void felt? How can I make absence felt? What does that entail? So the images of the tunnel felt like a very appropriate way of dealing with that idea. And also in the sculptures that you'll see images of, there are these objects that are enlarged versions of coins, of imperial Chinese coins that were often found at the sites where these workers used to live. Because of the fact that there's no existing firsthand accounts of their experiences, these pieces of trash essentially are all that we know about them. And I wanted to use that as, again, as an opportunity to think about their absence and their what does it mean to have these remnants, these architectural fragments, and what do they say, and what do they really don't say about these individuals? So a lot of the historical referencing that I do in these projects is quite speculative. I take quite a lot of liberties. I craft this narrative that is from the imagined subjectivity of one of these individuals, but it's also entirely fictional. And that's something I'm quite interested in. I don't usually do that in my work, but I thought that this was an opportunity, again, to use these gaps in the historical narrative to think about, again, how these absences can affect the present. How does history influence, how we create identity in this, in the present moment. And also, in a moment of intense violence and animosity towards diasporic Asian peoples in the U.S., I thought it was also a way to think about, to connect the past with these current tensions.
Thank you very much for that. I think I should also maybe just introduce my own practice briefly, as I'm also an artist, as I mentioned. So I guess the work that maybe I will speak a little bit about is the Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia. So it's a work that is basically, I would say, inspired by the question of what is Southeast Asia. The term Southeast Asia does not originate from within the region. So many people from Southeast Asia still don't really acknowledge that we are like one region. It's always something in question. So I would say the term Southeast Asia sort of entered into wider circulation during the Second World War. So the Allied forces came together to form a command strategic center called Southeast Asian Command. Yeah. And it was after the war that this term became more popular and was circulated widely. So essentially my work is a set of algorithms, which is editing images gleaned from the internet. So recombining these images according to 26 terms. And these 26 terms are 26 possible ways to reimagine Southeast Asia. So I suppose it is a kind of endless remixing machine, So now that that's out of the way, I can let's have a good conversation, Listening to all your presentations, something struck me, which is that in how we present our work, we all speak about time in a very particular way. I would say there are certain shapes of time that we describe. So I think, Chi Yin, you mentioned that for you, history is not necessarily linear, so time is not a straight line. And you mentioned that maybe it's circular. And I think, Mónica, you mentioned that as well. So there are these two shapes of time, right? Like a straight line or a circular time, right? And in Kenneth's talk, the first thing that struck me was this history of Chinese laborers building the railroad, right? And railroads, of course, are straight lines. But more than that, actually, I think time in the US became standardized across the different states, primarily because of the power of the railroad companies. They wanted to standardize time so that the system of train travel can become more efficient and effective, you know. So that had played a big part, big role in standardizing time across the US, and gradually that practice kind of like diffused out to like all the other states, you know. So another thing which struck me in your presentation is the mentioning of the void, the emptiness, you know, that something is missing. And I would think that when something is missing, it almost calls for its own repetition, you know. When something is missing, it feels incomplete, and hence there is a certain kind of like an energy, I would say, that wants to create a kind of like repetition, right, to fill that gap, or at least to deal with that emptiness. So in a certain sense, we are back to the circularity of time. So on that note, I wanted to ask, you know, if any of you might have something to speak about how you think of time, and whether you think of your own practice as a kind of traveling in time. Maybe we can begin with Chi Yin, because I remember reading one of your previous interviews where you did mention that you regarded your own practice as a kind of time travel. And I also found it interesting that you spoke about intergenerational connections as a kind of time travel, you know. So usually with time travel, we, you know, having watched too many science fiction films, we imagine complicated machines to bring us back into time. But I like how you were describing your process of traveling through time, through these kind of intergenerational connections. So,
yeah. Well, where to begin? I guess. So the first thing to declare is that I was trained in history. So my first 2 degrees were in history, which is why my work is very deeply historical, and I love archives. And I think actually working in an archive is a kind of time travel. But obviously that's a kind of backward time travel. And the more I started to work with the material, so these new series actually use a lot of found imagery, and especially with the magic lantern slides from the early 1900s, I started to think about time travel in at least 2 directions, so backwards as well as forwards. And it could also be to do with the fact that I had a child in the middle of COVID, or at the beginning of COVID. And those questions of not just intergenerational, but transgenerational inheritance really kind of weighed on me. Because there I was in the archive of the Imperial War Museum in the UK, heavily pregnant and desperately trying to work through the rest of the archive on this particular war before I had to go give birth. So I became interested in the idea of exposure. I became interested in the idea that the unborn child in utero was able to experience or become aware of what was happening outside in the world. And so that kind of led me down this slightly kooky road, maybe. I don't want to get all new agey here, but I really started to think about, yeah, what is it that passes down or gets lost between, you know, generations? And I guess the kind of driving question was also the fact that this grandfather of mine had been willfully forgotten by the family for over 60 years. And I had actually resurrected his presence in my son by giving my son a part of his Chinese name. So it's a kind of restitution, another R word that we could add to the list. And so, yeah, I became interested in this form of, you know, what is it that, or is there anything that transpires through the generations? And so I wanted to try and make a work around that. And when I came upon these magic lantern slides and started to collect them, I kind of felt that they were the kind of displacement of time-space that I was looking for. And so I somehow thought of it as a form of time travel, both backwards and forwards. And then there's the question of, you know, do these two individuals, my grandfather and my toddler son, actually, is there a chance that they could inhabit the same landscape at some point? So, I mean, I'm still kind of in the process of working through these as questions, more than, you know, having found any kind of strict answers to them.
Thank you for that. You know, so as we speak about time travel, it suddenly occurred to me, you know, certain anecdotes about time travel. So in time travel law, we often have, you know, you will sometimes encounter this phrase, which is the grandfather paradox. So just to explain that, unpack that a little bit. So hypothetically, if we imagine that we can travel back in time, and we assassinate our own grandfather before he has children, what then happens to us, right? So that's a kind of paradox, right, that's inherent in time travel. And that kind of like leads me to a second kind of anecdote, which is the observer effect. So like in science or physics, it is said that the presence of the observer changes what the observer is observing. So even if the observer tries not to interact with the event, just by being there, we already change it, right? So I think for all of us kind of like dealing with the past, just the very act of us maybe paying attention to that lost, that moment that is lost in time, we are already changing something in the present. So I wanted to ask, like, Kenneth, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think those time travel rules that you bring up point to this general understanding of if it were possible to travel backwards in time, the guiding principle is to do no harm, right? To not, you know, create some sort of a catastrophe by your presence in a sort of displaced temporal setting. But I think. Just speaking for generally, I think our interest in history and going backwards in time is in some ways to upset the present, actually, to do something that unsettles or creates displacements, or at least asks us to question various received notions of whatever subject matter that is. In terms of my own work, you know, thinking about this project and even more recent projects I've been doing and thinking about how I use research, there's often an impulse to think about the past as a way to stabilize an identity, to look at history as a way to kind of give meaning to the present, to give meaning to the here and now. And certainly thinking about, you know, for individuals that are immigrants or diasporic peoples, trying to find lineage is an attempt to create a sense of rootedness in a place that is, you know, somewhat foreign. And so thinking about Silent Spikes, part of the impetus to refer to these historical moments was a way to kind of ground, you know, questions of identity, really. Because in the US and probably everywhere, you know, immigration has come in waves. And with each wave, it creates a different sort of conditions for those peoples that, even though they may come from the same region, the same part of the world, due to these differing circumstances, for, you know, precipitating their arrival, they don't necessarily overlap in quite the same way. You know, my generation of immigrants coming to the United States is very different from those, let's say, from the generation or the period, sorry, of immigrant labor from, you know, the 19th century. So you know, it's tempting to kind of want to make connections in that way, but at the same time there are vast differences, and I'm really interested in that kind of tension. In the way that, you know, again, for people that are immigrants, that history is, or the sense of history is not quite clear. And the desire to place oneself through history is a really compelling one, but can also pose problems. And that's something I try to probe in some of my work.
Thank you for that. You know, what I found interesting with what you said was that in a, you know, the anecdotes I mentioned earlier were about how if we revisit the past, we try not to affect the past in order to change the present. But what you have just kind of shared with us is that we revisit the past precisely because we want to change something in the present, you know, in order to reframe the present. So I find that very interesting, and now it creates for me a certain connection to Monica's work. So although we have all shared our works as still images, it's a pity that we cannot hear the texts, the sounds that are created with our works. And with Monica's work, Path to the Stars, I would say I found the text especially beautifully written. And there was one particular passage that struck me, so I'm going to read it out. So it's a little bit embarrassing to read your own script to you, but yeah. So it's just, I think it's kind of like at the beginning part of Path to the Stars, and there was these lines which, you know, really struck me, which is, yeah, I will just read it, which is, don't do anything that does not suit you, proportionally in body and spirit, and every time you visit the past, wipe your feet. Right? So I got the passage, right? Yeah. So when I was reading it, like wiping your feet, cleaning your feet, it's a way to remove some traces to keep clean, you know. So I just thought that this kind of connects a little bit with what we were discussing about going back to the past and affecting the past or the present, right? So,
yeah, actually, there was a resonance because I was going to quote that, especially because I think when I bring history not as a concrete objective fact, but subjective and with multiple layers, multi-dimensional, with more than one perspective. And you know, I wrote the text as an intertext. I wrote with another Angolan writer, and there was many things there that we wanted to tackle through metaphors, through all the metaphors of time and history, through archetypal figures we used in the film when we were writing the script. That the actors, they were not the only players. Nature, the river, the water, they were metaphors for time. And water holds time also, because you know you can never cross the river, the same river twice, and it's always changing. So, and the soil and all these elements we had, like our brainstorm to build up the script. There was the body connection to the soil, to deep time. What can we bring with the ancestral time and connecting different generations? But also we were, you know, Angolan history, it's about colonial violence, and we didn't want to get stuck there. It's something that it makes part of our history, cannot change it. But our characters travel through time, proposing new arrangements of the history, utopical places of being, and also using the metaphor of the warrior as a metaphor to change what we can choose. And then there's interconnected realities of time in between what is, you know, our past as our memory, what we were, we didn't choose, and then our present, what we have more power to realize or to be conscious and try to choose and to be now present. And the future, how can we reimagine? So this was the line throughout the film, through the writing also, was to bring that. And I think sometimes we get stuck in our pain and trauma, and what we wanted really to retell, because sometimes when, you know, people look at the film, or you say you're Angolan, is always a story to tell about the war. But we wanted to bring that, but it's not a historical film, because there is a research on historical facts, archival also, but they are combined with fictional narrative to reach the voids of what was not told. But it was also a process of individuation, that this character, and that we have to understand history through our own self-development. So the character, she concealed an archetypal, unconscious archetype, and this is another time, the time of the unconscious, what we bring our shadows, what we have to play with, what we don't know. So this is the time we wanted to bring out. And the river, it had layers on the surface, it had the metaphor of the refugee crisis, it had the metaphor of the colonial violence, and on the surface and under, it had also the metaphor of the ecological crisis we wanted to bring, and the water mining, and all what globalization is doing to time, is shrinking time, and this river, and the journey was from the beginning of sunrise to sunset, and then you play out the story, and as the character goes down to the river, to the Atlantic, and the river was a signifier of the history of Angola, from pre-colonial, colonial, the recent ecological disasters, the Asian, it's been a lot of Asian political connections, through socialism and now through rebuilding the country. So there was all these images she was seeing on the edges of the river. So the river was taking her through, flowing in time, and then she was revisiting. But as you see, for instance, there's a part in the film where you have two army guys on a table, and she's looking at them while she's going through the sea, through the river. And then when you see, they having maps, and it looks like they're doing a war strategy, but the maps are actually maps, cosmological maps, where there was big powers involved on the war, like America, Russia, China, South Africa. So I did the charts of what was the connection, the birth date of each country, and then I did a marriage, and I did a birth, like a cosmological map of the relationship of Angola with these countries. And then they were talking about that, but it was a meta-narrative talking about what happened, and then really making another reference to this resonance of space and time. Yeah.
Thank you. That was very beautiful. One word that struck me that you've mentioned quite a bit was metaphor. And I think, if I remember correctly, the Greek roots of the word metaphor is metaphorine, which essentially means to transport or to carry over. So in a certain sense, I'm now imagining the metaphor as a kind of machine that allows us to move across space, but also move across time, And the other thing which also struck me, which kind of like connected with what Kenneth was mentioning about the voids, and for you were mentioning of the trauma. And I like what you mentioned about how we want to revisit the trauma, but not to get stuck in it. So I guess the Freudian kind of like construction of what is a trauma, it's essentially an event in your past, and because it was so traumatic, we cannot process it, right? So this unprocessed trauma doesn't go away, it doesn't disappear, it just keeps repeating itself in a different form as a neurosis, possibly. So in a way, I think how to revisit the past and not get stuck on it so that we can continue to flow. I kind of sense that in all of our practices. Yeah. And Anything to add from you guys?
Well, if I may, I just found that there were a lot of points of connection
Sure.
between what Kenneth and Mónica were saying, and maybe this is a more of a methodological kind of take, but I think, I mean, the mention of void and gaps definitely were all sort of trying to work in between what's already there in the official archives and trying to make those spaces generative. And the other thing is you've already mentioned critical fabulation, and I think all of us are using the speculative and the fictive as liberating spaces to get out of that rut of dealing with the past and the trauma that comes with it. Personally, I spent the last 10 years or so looking at the traumatic historical record and making some kind of a counter archive of my own on this particular war. And then with these two new bodies of work, I've started to depart from the document and the specific histories, and I found it to be very liberating. And so, getting into the speculative and fictive, and obviously getting into the territory of critical fabulation. But I think it might be interesting just to talk about the methods of the speculative and the fictive in each of our works.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. So I think that's a good suggestion for how we can move to our next question. And I would say, like, with methodology, one word that kind of struck me is remix. So again, I have to point to Chi Yin, because in one of her interviews, I also read that you describe what you do as remixing. Yeah. And I would then, kind of share the question with the other two panelists as well, because I would like to know what you think of the word remix, and in dealing with history. Like, what does that kind of like mean for each of you? But maybe we can begin with you first.
I knew he was going to blame me for this.
Yeah.
Just joking. I'm sure Stephanie came up with the title before she consulted my work. But yes, I am guilty of the fact that I did use the word remix. I think I was using it quite simplistically in a way. I was thinking of myself as a kind of DJ. And because I had collected these Magic Lantern slides from various sources, mostly doing a lot of shopping on eBay. And I collected things that were about astrology from the late 1800s mostly. Pictures of like what we see now, a comet, mostly from illustrations as well as photographic images shot through telescopes in both the UK and the US. And the other main kind of source was these images from specifically of Malaya, British Malaya, or just, kind of Southeast Asia. Most of these slides come with no provenance, so there's no way to know what precisely they are. And so I started to mess with them in a way. I started to, if you look carefully, you'll spot my grandfather and my son in the images. I hand painted them into the images to match the aesthetic of that time. And then I sort of created this kind of sequence, because Magic Lantern slides originally had a performative function. They were used in lectures. And my initial interest in them was that they were used by the colonial powers to educate people about the colonies. So I wanted to sort of usurp, if you like, that technology and repurpose it for my anti-colonial telling. And so I saw it as a kind of, a DJ mixing up some songs and coming up with his or her own tune. So I was using remix in that very pedestrian way. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, in terms of remixing, I think I'm a product of, my biography, my DNA. I mixed heritage, so understanding your place, duality and hybridity, to talk also about, a third space where you have assemble different parts of different culture and incorporate that on, and your sense of belonging is multiple, so it is a remixing. I mean, also connecting to what you said in terms of the films. I use that a lot. In hip hop culture, we have the samples, as you said, the DJ. Actually, the film, and I've been collaborating with a musician. They is a rapper, and the music of the film, it has lots of remixing. It has lots of different sources of music that they were reappropriated and they were incorporated in the film to connect to different realities. So the sound is a remixing of many times because, you know, visually with the text you can propose these multi-temporalities, but with the sound you can go further. And this is really where the remixing is. And I think when you also talking about different temporalities, you are remixing different spaces, mental spaces, physical spaces, you know, and emotional spaces. So, I think we are in a place of remixing. Yeah.
So, Kenneth, are you a remixer?
I suppose, yeah. I think certainly within Silent Spikes there are moments of remixing or of sort of appropriating different genres, whether it's the soundtrack that I use. I chose because I thought that using East Asian stringed instruments that I thought sounded or could be mistaken for something that would come out of a Western film, a soundtrack, so that kind of cultural confusion, or even remixing in terms of identity. A more recent project of mine looks at the formation of group identity within fraternity culture in the US amongst young men, and the ways in which those groups often borrow quite randomly in order to create a sense of identity. They, you know, that seems like a very sort of natural inclination to want to both forge an independent sense of self based on shared culture, but at the same time, one that is mostly wholly invented. And so I think that this remixing becomes a really palpable, powerful tool when it comes to diasporic people that, you know, again, come to a place and don't have a sense of identity through history, so kind of must use what's available to them to kind of forge a new identity. And I think that can be a really interesting kind of fertile space to explore. But yeah, even in some of the sculptures that I included images of, it's funny that you mentioned eBay because I also use that as a kind of space for the kind of a surplus store of history, if you will, right? Where all these sort of random artifacts sort of end up. And within some of the sculptures, I often, or I used eBay as a way to kind of find artifacts from a specific time, but juxtaposed with very contemporary objects. Again, playing with the historical record, or again, confusing that. Trying to draw perhaps or make comparisons between past and present, but again, but not respecting or being disrespectful of the discipline of a historian, let's say, which I am not, and I have no sort of training in that. But I think it's a useful way to unpack the present. eBay as like shopping through eBay as a way to understand the present.
Thank you. That's a beautiful metaphor. Yeah, so I would like to return at a later point on this question of remixing history. And I would say to a certain extent that's also what I do. But at the same time, I'm always a little bit troubled by it. But I will explain that maybe a little bit later. But for now, you know, I just some quick kind of like thoughts, like kind of thinking about the words remix and also collage, which is what you were doing with the Magic Lantern slides, right? So when you are making a collage, you have different elements that you bring together, and each of these elements comes from a different temporal moment. So it's a collage is also already a layering of different types of time, you know. And just thinking about different types of time, you know, this brings me back to what Mónica was used in her description of your work, which is you speak about different types of time, You know, I would say there's the time of the individual, the time of geopolitics, there's the time of the deep time of the planet itself. So in thinking about time, we are not just thinking about different perspectives. Actually, what we are dealing with is different scales. So we are really dealing with like different scales of time. And then you mentioned cosmology, which I suppose is time at its largest scale. So in a certain sense, like, you know, I'm just like kind of like wondering, how do we deal with this multiplicity of scales, right? So this is not just a multi-perspectival look, but we are actually traveling between scales. So, you know, just to kind of like free associate a little bit more, I'm somehow now thinking about Alice in Wonderland, because for those of you who's read the book, Alice basically goes down the rabbit hole, but she's also actually always changing in scale. She becomes gigantic, or she becomes like very small, you know. So I'm now also thinking of your art practices as a kind of vehicle for traveling between scales, you know. So maybe the term could be interscalar vehicles, you know, just as we have time machines yeah. And another point which I want to speak a little bit about is what I mentioned earlier about shapes of time, right? We all have, right now we've mentioned, I would say, two kinds of shapes. One is a straight line, and the other is the circle. Yeah. And Mónica, you mentioned a lot the river as a kind of metaphor of time. But it just struck me that a river, in a certain sense, is linear, right? So you can't step into the same river twice because it always keeps flowing. So is the time of the river a straight line, you know? But at the same time, we are all interested in some kind of repetition, which is circular time. So how do you deal with these two very different shapes of time?
I think it depends how you read the river. You can read it through the stream, but you can read it from surface to the bottom. So I really think, you know, the water is circulates through different structures, and structures of the nature and the forms is going to occupy. And the water, it's a great symbol because it penetrates everything. And it takes the shape of what is around. And also, it recalls a feminine time. And this is really also connecting water to soil. And if we look at soil, also is another time, because the organic matter, you know, it's like also looking at death, it becomes life. So looking at this soil, the water, it's important to be an element of connection. And looking at also, you know, because through colonial experience, we've been very monolithic in terms of acknowledgement, rational, and diversity is something that through monoculture, it was completely took over our lands. And this is something we also have to bring, because when we reimagine new futures, the imagination has another time of constructing, you know, a diverse place, and also understanding the ancestral time. The land was more of a feminine place. Motherland, it has another time, the ancestral, what you talked also about generations. And what we see now, it's a very different time of extractivism, fasts, that we want to shrink time to take the resources out. So I think this, you know, question of the Anthropocene, and now we also I mean, Shivananda, she talked about how the land is becoming capital and not life. And we have to understand that the soil that we step, it has time on it. And we understand also time different when through mortality, you know, because as we get older, we understand time is different. We cannot be the superheroes all the time. We have a time limit. So your perception changes. And the soil is a very great metaphor to understand how you can transform and transmute through death matter into life. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Just, suddenly I'm also thinking, you know, back into the metaphor of the river and the shape of time in it. So sometimes when you think about the river, of course, you were mentioning we can think of it as the stream, which is linear. But sometimes you have small obstacles in the river, and it creates actually what we call like eddies. So meaning that even the water flow can go backwards in a stream, right? So there are these moments when time could actually flow backwards as well. So that's something that just kind of like came up, right? And thinking about collage as this like different types of time that are kind of like layered onto a single image. Suddenly now I'm also thinking about Kenneth's, you know, really amazing work, Silent Spikes. In a sense, like for me, when I was watching your video, you know, I also started thinking about a different type of collage, you know, which is not so much a collage on a planar surface, but the body itself as a site of collage, because you did something which was like super interesting, which is having a kind of contemporary dancer to reinterpret the bodily movements of the laborers, right? So in a certain sense, that is already a kind of collage. Yeah. Do you have something?
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I've never really thought about it like that, but I certainly do think about my work is very interested in the ways in the body as a site for different kinds of perhaps like cultural memory, or certainly the articulation of identity, different kinds of the way that different kinds of practices can be mapped onto a body. Certainly, well, the more recent project deals with that in a more sort of explicit manner, but in Silent Spikes, the body does become a way of articulating certain, not necessarily absences, but the ways in which there are certain limitations or expectations that are placed on the body, and how movement and choreography might sort of exceed those limitations, let's say. A lot of the video has these kinds of abstract movements that are drawn from things I was watching online that are associated with what cowboys do and the rodeo, and the ways in which that resembled a certain kind of choreography, a very sensuous choreography that is not recognized as such by those that are actually doing it, but, you know, in a kind of removed aesthetic sense. I thought that was really powerful, and I wanted to isolate that and make that more felt. But I actually wanted to kind of go back a little bit and respond to what Mónica was saying about the dirt and the vehicle of time. Because one thing that I think is really interesting, perhaps in what we're all doing, is trying to make time palpable and felt. Because I think a lot about the way in which we understand time in a contemporary sense, and, you know, the largest archive for time right now is perhaps the internet, and the way that it radically flattens time in a way that doesn't really create distinctions or hierarchies, or at least, like, you know, everything can happen simultaneously without really any sense of distinction, I guess. And I think so much of what we're doing, or at least what I'm understanding that we're all doing, is trying to create moments where, yeah, time can be felt in its passage or in its kind of uniqueness. And certainly within dirt as this like incredible, rich, fertile vessel that contains the past. And you know, I use that in my own work too, and I think that a way that helps to slow down our perception of time. I think that's something that is very lost in our contemporary way of understanding the world, particularly when all time can be accessible at any time, right? Like, what does that mean? How do we? I don't know. How do we give meaning to time itself when it seems to be losing that more and more so?
Thank you so much for that. In Buddhism, time is an illusion, so there is no time. And I was just recently also reading a book which by a physicist who says that essentially time is only produced by the human mind through our own like memory, so it's doesn't really exist, so laws of physics are usually symmetrical. So if you push something to one side, you can always reverse that by pushing it back. But time seems to be the only thing that doesn't go backward for us, So maybe that's why time in some sense is an illusion. And I'm very glad that you brought up the internet time, because that's one of the contemporary forms of time that we deal with. And Mónica, you brought up the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is actually all about time, right? It's basically that geological activities which take a really long time span can now be produced by human effects in a very short time. So we can understand the Anthropocene itself as this distortion of time scales, So those were some thoughts that came up as I was listening to you both. And then also I'm starting to think of back to the shapes of time. So we've just been talking about straight lines and circles. So I think another interesting shape to think about is the spiral, which is neither a straight line or a circle, but something kind of in between, right? It repeats, but never exactly. So there's repetition, but the repetition is also difference at the same time. Right, so that's another thought that I had, right? Yeah. And maybe now I would move to the kind of for me, the most kind of challenging question, in thinking about remixing and history, back to that question, right? So in a certain sense, I would say what we do is a certain kind of revisionism, can I say that? Of what exists as kind of dominant historical narratives. We are all trying in one sense or another to revise that, right? But it just struck me that in Japan, for example, in the context of Japan, when we think of the word revisionism, it usually refers to a very specific ideological group, let's say the right wing, who, for example, deny the war crimes, right? So they are often critiqued as as being revisionist, because they are revising what is the true objective version of history, right? So sometimes for me, I get a little bit troubled by that when we are remixing the past, right? So what essentially differentiates us, let's say, from the, these other types of remixers or revisionists, So how do we think about this, problem or question, right? So what differentiates our practice from those that operate from a different, let's say, ideological spectrum? I wonder if anyone wants to.
Well, I think in some or many parts of the world, revisionism is a bit of a bad word. And where we come from, it's also a bad word. I think there is a difference. Maybe I can't articulate it fully right now, but I think revisionism is much stronger than remixing. And so I speak as someone who was trained in the methods of history and then, kind of have come around to sort of questioning and problematizing it. And I now prefer the methods of a research-based art practice. and it's quite deliberate. There are many, many problems with the academic practice of history. And I mean, the origins of that might be that there is a multitude of problems with what we know as the archive. So I won't go into all that, that's too much PhD speak. But I don't think we're beginning, first of all, from an ideological position. And I don't think we're necessarily trying to point out what's right or wrong. I think we're just trying to complicate what's out there as maybe official or semi-official narratives. I think in both Mónica and my case, if I may speak a little bit for you as well, there are specific ways that the histories of those wars have been told, and we're saying, hang on a minute, there's other ways of looking at it and retelling it and experiencing it. And I suppose this is sort of like using artistic method to create an intervention in public memory of these conflicts. At least that's how I broadly see my work at this point. So I don't see myself as a revisionist, but there is some kind of remixing going on, although that's not typically how I describe what I do as well. I have used words like restituting and repair and excavating and all this kind of stuff, but each of these terms are problematic. So yeah, I mean, there's all of those in the mix, but none of those terms, I think, encapsulate what we're trying to do.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Anyone wants to add to this?
I mean, I don't know if I have an answer, but it is like a rather provocative suggestion to make that, comparing the ways in which, in America, we're living in a moment in which the things that we're watching happen unfold are being told to us. Like, no, actually, it didn't happen. Didn't happen that way. That wasn't an insurrection. That was a peaceful protest. You were constantly being forced to question the things that we're seeing firsthand, and revisionism is happening in the present. And I don't think artists are doing that. I think that artists certainly are trying to question history. I don't think we're trying to rewrite it. I don't think we're trying to assume. We're not trying to. We don't have a relationship of like authority to this material. I don't think. I think it's really. Really questioning these grand narratives, slowing down the ways in which we consume things, certainly not trying to use this information to promote violence. I think that using history as a kind of material, history as a space for play or fabulation, or just reimagining the present or the future. I think those are the kinds of productive ways in which artists work with the past. I don't know, those are just some immediate thoughts.
Sure, I think that's great. I think both of you have already kind of, gave us many suggestions of how to think about this problem. I would say one is that we all approach it as artists, right? So what we produce in a certain sense is a kind of an artifact. We don't really kind of like lay claim to a certain authority, as you mentioned. And at the same time, I think what we produce, perhaps what we are after is a certain kind of destabilizing of a narrative from the past, right? And the alternatives that we provide is we are aware that this is like one version that we are generating, and it doesn't lay claim to being the only story, right, that it's told.
I agree with everything you're saying. I mean, it's in your words, you are saying also my words, but there's only one quotation I would like to refer that was coming to my mind, the Nigerian writer, Ashembe, that he says that only when the lion gets a historian is that we stop glorifying the hunter and we can get another story. So this is the story we are telling. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah, yeah, I think we are almost done. Is there anything that we would like to bring up before I open the floor to the audience? Anything? Yeah? Okay, great. So now we come to the most difficult part, like questions from the audience, if there are any. Please feel free to join into the conversation. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions you would like to pose to anyone on the panel? Yeah. While letting you take time to formulate your questions, maybe I will just ramble on a little bit as you think. I think we've so far spoken about like time machines because of the frame that we've started with today, which is time travel. So often that brings us to the realm of science fiction. But at the same time, another metaphor or another figure that kind of pops up, I would say, is how should I put it? The ghost or the specter, right? Which is, I think it kind of passes through all of our works in some sense. So for me, the ghost is perhaps also a different type of time machine, right? So in Hamlet, like in the first scene when he encounters the ghost of his dead father, and he says famously, time is out of joint, after he encounters the father. So time, the straight line of time gets broken and things have to repeat in a different sense, right? So that was just one term that came up. And yesterday when I was chatting with an artist friend about the panel today, he was talking about his own work and in relation to shamanism. And we could think of shamanism as a kind of essentially a time travel practice, because as you channel different beings from the past or from other types of time, it is also, in a sense, a certain kind of time travel. So it doesn't just have to be science fiction. We could also go into like different types of metaphors in thinking about time. Yeah. So I've given you enough time now. So any questions or queries? Yeah. Sure.
Thank you for this incredible talk. My question is for Chi Yin. I'm interested in your introduction about how you work with archives, and that you said that you love archives and you see it as a kind of time travel. And I just would like to ask a simple question, if you could elaborate a bit more on your experience of working with archives and what kind of limitations you might face when you're doing research in them, and also in terms of archives, do you think that they're also a space in which fiction can play a role, and artist intervention in that space as well? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. That's a quite big question. Well, first of all, what is an archive? So yeah, when I kind of spoke plainly just now about working in archives, I kind of meant the bricks and mortar colonial archives that we know. But I think in the past 10 years or so, I've really been creating my own archives too, whether you want to call them counter archives or not. So yeah, I mean, in a very broad sense, archives. But I think you're more interested in like the bricks and mortar archives and how do you work with them. Yeah, I mean, there's huge limitations. Not every archive, welcomes interventions. I have a series of work actually called Interventions, for the multiple meanings of that word. And with that, I looked specifically at the Imperial War Museum photographic archive. I looked at the entire collection on Malaya and this war. And I created interventions in them by making these collages using light. I photographed the archival prints on a light table to merge verso and recto into one plane, to sort of reveal the layers of indexing that have gone on in the archive. It wasn't an intervention that was welcomed by the museum. I kind of brought it to them. I entered this archive as a PhD researcher, and then basically decided to make a work from it, and so had to renegotiate access. And so yeah, it can be tricky, but it really kind of ranges in terms of experience from archive to archive. And yeah, some are more conservative than others, and some, I think increasingly people are looking at decolonizing their collections. So, you know, I think this is the time to go and look at those official archives. And the space of fiction and speculation in those archives is huge because there are huge gaps. And I started out thinking I wanted to fill those gaps, and I'm not so sure that that's what I'm doing now. I'm just using those gaps and conjuring. The spectral really is a presence, I think, in all of our works, whether it's in those gaps between the documents, or whether it's in the landscape, or in people, or the figurative characters that pop up in our work. I think the specters of history, the specters of time are all present.
Anyone else would like to ask, please? Yeah.
Thank you. I observed that I think some of the works that I mentioned, or the motivation for the works, also came from a personal journey or personal association with the communities, with family history. And so as an artist, as well as kind of double hatting with being a historian, how do you see this association affecting and not affecting the work that you choose to do in portraying the perspectives and your connection with that work, as well as who you want to bring it to? Thank you.
Is there someone specific that you would like to address that question?
Actually, I would love if all the artists could respond, because I noticed that with the Asian American story and lineage, also there's certain relationships there, and with family history and with the heritage. I think it's a great starting point, but how do we then use that and associate or disassociate with the work that we're doing? So I would love to hear from the artists.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can we start with you?
Yeah, I think with Silent Spikes, that I don't think that necessarily came from a particularly personal place, but certainly those histories were always sort of, I knew about them but didn't know very much about them. They were always sort of there but not there simultaneously. And so when I had the opportunity to make this work, I thought it was a good time to kind of explore the history, but also my relationship to this material. And I really think that part of the impetus around this project was, one, the sense of trying to use history as a way to root identity, or to root a place for perhaps for individuals who don't have that for whatever reason. But then, you know, after doing research around this history, I felt that it didn't actually provide me with that sense of place. I think it actually opened up more questions as to what my relationship to this material actually was. Do I have a connection with this? I know this is important, but how does that determine who I am in the present? And so I thought that was really interesting. I think that you know, that sense of ambivalence is important in the sense that, you know, while history is important, it cannot be the answer to all of the questions we have about how we imagine ourselves, let's say, in terms of questions of identity, or yeah, I guess identity was a huge driving force of this project and others. So I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we are all, as individuals, are like kind of living archives, and I'm interested in excavating the internal in relationship to this larger body of knowledge that exists outside, and using my work as a way of mediating those two. Not using history as a kind of authoritative repository of information, but I don't know, as something that I can kind of take what I need to, I guess. I speak, you know, as an artist, and, you know, in the ways that, again, like I said before, history is a kind of, as a material for the work. history versus history as a kind of authoritative determiner of who I am or what it is that I make, if that makes sense.
Mónica, would you?
Yeah, for me, I think the place of the biography or self-referential is really important. Even the stories I tell, they come from places I'm connected to. So, for instance, the film Path to the Stars, it was a story. They came because when I go on holiday to Angola, Luanda, it's a city that is overcrowded because because of the war. It was made for a very small population, and everyone came from the countryside and they occupied the city. So it's a very intense city. So what I do, I usually escape with my daughter 1 hour away, and we go to the river, to the mouth of the river. And this is what he brought me to write the story. So it comes really much from finding a story in a place I occupy, that I live. So even if it's a personal journey that it took me there, then that place is start to tell me a story. I have to sit and listen. What is this place telling me? And then is when I go and get more information and try to bring the voices are there within the landscape, within the river. So everything it becomes, it's a personal story, self-referential. Even the characters they come, the woman, she in herself, she's a personification of my state of being as being a single mom, so and also family history in terms of the connection to the liberation struggle, independence. So everything I do, it has a personal connection. And I try to connect with broader themes, but I can only talk from my own place.
Beautiful, thank you. And would you like to?
Well, yeah, so my work obviously starts from family history, but it's not necessarily foregrounded in some of the exhibitions that I've made or books that I've made. And I think, it's intentionally subjective, and there's no claim to objectivity in it. I think we are trying to problematize the so-called objective version of history. So it is necessarily subjective, and I wear that on my sleeve now as someone who's trained formally as a historian. But so I don't really see a problem in that. I think the story is very personal, but I also think that I often say the story is as small and as big as you want to make it, because anti-colonial struggle was common to many parts of the world during the Cold War, and these are things that we're reckoning with as histories, but they really inform the present. And I think in the kind of work we're doing, we're also opening up questions of where that leads us in the future. So I think we're making necessarily subjective work, and I think there's no problem with that. We are artists, that's our position, and we make no truth claim in the work that we make. So yeah, I don't really see that there's an issue with it. Yeah, and of course, all of us try to make work that. Your question about the audience that you want to bring the work to, I think we all try to make work that allow different access points and allow people to find their own resonances in the work. So it could be a very specific story about one grandfather who was killed by the nationalists in communist China, but I think you would find access points to memory and skeletons in every family's closet, and many other themes of loss and grief and love and trauma and survival and resilience. I think there are enough universal themes, and I think that's the magic of art also, that you open up these spaces of resonance. Yeah.
I think that's really the perfect way for us to end the session, as we are out of time. So thank you for sitting through this talk. I just realized it is the duration of a feature film. So yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you.